He had nothing left to his name, and yet somehow, years later, everything would be given back to him. The wind moved softly across the open field, bending rows of tall grass that stretched farther than the eye could measure, at least 100 acres of quiet, untouched land beneath a pale American sky. A wooden gate creaked as it swung inward, its hinges worn but steady, as if it had been waiting a long time for this exact moment. Daniel Hayes stood there, just outside the threshold, his boots still dusted with city grime that didn't belong in a place like this. His coat was thin for the season, sleeves frayed, the kind of coat a man keeps not because it's warm, but because it's all he has left. Beside him, a German shepherd named Ranger stood alert, ears forward, amber eyes scanning the horizon like he was trying to understand something too big for words. In front of them, the land opened wide and silent, a farmhouse resting in the distance, its white paint faded but intact, its porch wrapped in shadow and memory. Daniel didn't move. Not yet. His hands stayed buried in his pockets, fingers curled tight around nothing. A man like him doesn't step into a place like this easily. Not after years of sleeping under bridges, counting loose change, learning how to disappear in plain sight. A black sedan idled behind him on the gravel road, engine humming low, the kind of car that never belonged in Daniel's world. A man in a pressed suit stood a few feet away, holding a folder against his chest like it carried something heavier than paper. His voice, when it came, was calm, practiced, almost too gentle for what it carried. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "this property, all of it, was left to you." The words hung in the air, simple, clean, impossible. Ranger stepped forward first, paws pressing into the dirt beyond the gate, then turned back as if asking permission without a sound. Daniel's eyes followed him, then drifted out across the field again, taking in the fence lines, the distant barn, the slow sway of grass under a breeze that smelled like earth and something close to peace. He swallowed, but no words came. Men like Daniel don't get second chances wrapped in open land. And quiet skies. Not without a reason. Not without a past that still lingers somewhere behind them. The lawyer opened the folder, pages shifting softly, but Daniel didn't look. He was still staring ahead, as if the land might disappear if he blinked. Somewhere in that silence, something unspoken settled between the man, the dog, and the place that had been waiting. Because this wasn't luck. It wasn't chance. And it definitely wasn't charity. This was something else. Something older. Something earned long before Daniel ever stepped foot on this road. And as the wind carried across the field again, brushing against his worn coat and the fur along Ranger's back, the past, quiet, relentless, and unfinished, began to rise. Before the land, before the quiet, before a man in a pressed suit ever spoke his name, Daniel Hayes was someone the world had already decided to forget. The nights came colder back then, not just in temperature but in the way silence settled into the bones. Under a concrete overpass just outside the city limits, where the hum of distant traffic never really stopped, Daniel lay wrapped in a thin blanket that smelled faintly of dust and old rain. The ground beneath him was hard, unforgiving, and carried the chill of late November straight through his coat. Beside him, Ranger lay curled close, his body angled toward Daniel as if shielding him from a world that had long since turned its back. The dog's breathing was slow and steady, a quiet rhythm that Daniel had come to rely on more than sleep itself. Once, Daniel had known structure, purpose, the kind of life measured in missions and clear orders. He had worn a uniform that meant something, stood beside men who trusted him without question, and walked through days where every step had direction. Now, direction was replaced by survival. Morning meant finding a place that would not ask him to leave too quickly. Afternoon meant counting what little change he had managed to gather. Evening meant preparing for another night that offered no guarantees. People passed him every day, some with quick glances, others with none at all. To them, he was just another shadow on the sidewalk, another story too. Complicated to understand in a single glance. But Ranger never looked away. The German shepherd watched everything, ears alert, eyes tracking movement with a quiet intensity that never faded. He had once been trained, that much was clear in the way he responded to Daniel's voice, in the discipline that lingered beneath the surface. But whatever past Ranger carried, it no longer mattered. What mattered was that he stayed. Always. That morning had started like any other. A thin fog clung to the streets, softening the edges of buildings and turning the city into something distant, almost unreal. Daniel sat on the curb near a closed diner, his hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm long before he finished it. The scent of it still lingered, bitter but grounding. Ranger sat beside him, posture upright despite the fatigue that showed in the slight droop of his tail. Cars moved past in steady lines, their headlights cutting through the haze as people drove toward lives that Daniel no longer belonged to. He did not ask for anything. Not anymore. There was a time when he had tried, when pride had not yet been worn down by too many refusals and too many looks that carried more judgment than kindness. But that time had passed quietly, without announcement. Now, he simply existed between moments, taking what came and letting the rest move on without him. A gust of wind slipped through the street, carrying with it the faint smell of rain and distant asphalt. Ranger lifted his head slightly, nose twitching as if catching something unseen. Daniel noticed the shift, the subtle tension in the dog's posture, and followed his gaze down the street. Something was coming. Not loud, not urgent, just different enough to break the pattern of another ordinary day. And in a life where every day felt the same, even the smallest difference could change everything. It was not the sound that drew Daniel's attention first, but the absence of it. The steady rhythm of the street seemed to falter for a moment, like the city itself had taken a breath and forgotten to release it. Ranger was already on his feet, ears forward, body still but alert, his gaze fixed down the block where a dark sedan had come to a quiet stop along the curb. It was not the kind of car that usually lingered in this part of town. Clean lines, polished surface, the kind of presence that stood out without trying. The engine remained running, a low hum barely noticeable beneath the distant traffic, but something about it felt out of place. Daniel watched without moving, his fingers tightening slightly around the empty paper cup before he set it aside. People stepped around him as they always did, some glancing toward the car, others too busy to notice anything at all. The passenger door opened slowly, not with urgency, but with hesitation. A woman stepped out, her movements careful, measured, as if the ground itself might shift beneath her feet. She wore a long coat, dark and well-made, the kind that carried quiet wealth without needing to announce it. Her hair, silver at the edges, was pulled back neatly, though a few strands had slipped loose in the damp air. She stood there for a moment, one hand resting lightly against the car door, her breathing visible in the cool morning like fragile smoke. Ranger took a step forward, then paused, looking back at Daniel. There was no command, no word spoken, just a look passed between them, the kind that had been built over time and trust. Daniel rose slowly, his joints stiff from the cold, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the woman from a distance. Something was wrong. Not dramatic, not loud, but quiet in a way that felt heavier. The driver stepped out from the front seat, circling the car with quick, uncertain steps, speaking in a low voice that did not quite reach Daniel's ears. The woman shook her head once, as if dismissing help, then took a few steps away from the vehicle. Her balance wavered. It was subtle, the kind of movement most people would miss, but Daniel did not. He had seen that kind of shift before, in places where small signs mattered more than words. Ranger let out a soft sound, not quite a bark, more like a question. Daniel exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cold air as he watched the scene unfold. He could have stayed where he was. No one expected anything from him. No one ever. Didn't the world had made that clear enough? The woman took another step, then another, each one less steady than the last. Her hand reached out slightly, not toward anyone in particular, just into the space in front of her as if searching for something to hold onto. The driver's voice grew sharper now, concern breaking through whatever distance had been there before. People nearby began to slow, their attention caught by the shift in tone, but no one moved closer. Not yet. Daniel felt it then, that quiet pull between doing nothing and doing something that would change the direction of a day he had already accepted as ordinary. His eyes dropped briefly to Ranger, who stood ready, waiting without pressure, without demand. Just present. Always present. Daniel rubbed his hands together once, as if warming them for something more than the cold, then stepped off the curb. Each step forward felt heavier than it should have, not because of distance, but because of choice. He crossed the space between them without hurry, without hesitation now, the noise of the city fading behind him as the moment narrowed into something smaller, more focused. The woman's knees gave slightly as he reached her, not a fall, not a collapse, just enough to tell him that she needed help whether she would ask for it or not. He did not speak right away. He simply stepped close enough to steady her, one hand lifting gently, offering support without force, without intrusion. He said quietly, his voice steady, calm in a way that carried more reassurance than urgency, "You are not alone." Ranger moved in beside him, close but careful, his presence grounding the space around them like an anchor no one else could see. And for the first time that morning, the world did not look past Daniel Hayes. It paused, just long enough to see him. The woman's weight leaned into Daniel's arm, not heavily, but enough for him to feel the quiet urgency beneath her composed exterior. Up close, he could see the faint tremor in her fingers, the subtle strain in her breathing as she tried to steady herself without drawing attention. She was not fragile in the way people assumed weakness, but in the way something strong begins to falter without warning. Ranger stood close at Daniel's side, his presence calm but unwavering, his amber eyes fixed on the woman with a focus that seemed almost human. The driver reached them then, his polished shoes scraping lightly against the pavement, his voice tight with concern. "Please, you need to sit down," he said, glancing briefly at Daniel before returning his attention to her. There was hesitation in that glance, not distrust exactly, but uncertainty, as if unsure how someone like Daniel fit into a moment like this. Daniel did not react to it. He had grown used to being misread. Instead, he shifted slightly, guiding the woman toward the curb with careful, measured movements. "Easy now," he said quietly, his tone low and steady, the kind that carried weight without force. The woman allowed it, her posture softening just enough to accept the help she had resisted moments earlier. As she lowered herself onto the edge of the sidewalk, Daniel remained close, one hand hovering near her shoulder, not touching unless needed. Ranger sat beside them, alert but still, as if guarding the space from anything that might disturb it. The morning air carried the faint scent of rain, mixing with the distant aroma of coffee and asphalt, grounding the moment in something real and immediate. The driver pulled out a phone, his fingers moving quickly, voice dropping into a hurried conversation that Daniel did not follow. Sirens were not yet audible, but they would come. They always did. The woman exhaled slowly, her eyes closing for a brief second before opening again, clearer now, though still shadowed by something deeper than simple fatigue. She turned her head slightly, her gaze settling on Daniel with a quiet intensity that felt deliberate. "You stayed," she said, her voice soft but steady, carrying a note of something Daniel could not quite place. He shrugged faintly, a small motion that carried no pride, no expectation. "Someone had to," he replied. There was no weight in his words, no attempt to make the moment larger than it was. Just a simple truth spoken without decoration. The woman studied him for a second longer, as if trying to understand something beyond what she could see. Her eyes flicked briefly to Ranger, taking in the dog's calm posture, the way he remained close without needing command. "What is his name?" she asked. "Ranger," Daniel said, his voice softening slightly as he glanced down at the dog. Ranger's tail moved once against the pavement, a quiet acknowledgement. The woman nodded slowly, her hand lifting just enough to rest lightly against Ranger's head. He did not move away. He never did from those who meant no harm. "He trusts you," she said. Daniel let out a small breath that almost resembled a laugh, though there was no humor in it, only something deeper. "He is the only one who does," he answered. The driver stepped back toward them, lowering the phone. "They are on their way," he said, his tone more controlled now, though the tension had not fully left him. Daniel nodded once, then shifted his weight slightly, preparing to step back. Moments like this were not his to keep. They belonged to people with names, with places, with lives that continued forward without interruption. But before he could move, the woman's voice stopped him. "Wait," she said, her hand lifting just slightly, not enough to grab, just enough to ask. Daniel paused, turning back toward her. Her gaze held his again, steady now, clearer than before. "What is your name?" she asked. The question hung there, simple and direct, yet heavier than it should have been. Daniel hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, the kind of pause that comes from a man who has not been asked that question in a long time. Then he answered, quietly, without embellishment. "Daniel," he said. The woman nodded once, as if committing it to memory, not as a detail, but as something that mattered. And somewhere beneath the noise of the city, beneath the passing cars and distant voices, something shifted, small and unseen, but permanent all the same. The sound of approaching sirens began as a distant echo, low and steady, threading its way through the morning air like a reminder that this moment was never meant to last. The driver straightened slightly, glancing down the street with visible relief, while Daniel remained still. His attention fixed on the woman seated beside him. Her breathing had steadied, not fully, but enough to suggest that whatever had shaken her was beginning to pass. Ranger shifted closer, his shoulder brushing lightly against Daniel's leg, a quiet signal that the moment was changing. Daniel understood that signal. He always did. He glanced once toward the sound of the sirens, then back at the woman, as if measuring the space between staying and leaving. It was never an easy line to walk, but it was one he had learned over time. He did not belong in endings. He only passed through beginnings. The woman's gaze followed his movement, noticing the subtle shift in his posture, the way his weight had already begun to lean away from the moment. "You are going," she said, not as a question, but as an observation. Daniel gave a small nod, almost imperceptible. "You are going to be all right," he replied instead, his voice calm, steady, as if that answer was enough. The driver stepped closer, his tone now more controlled, more composed. "They will be here in less than a minute," he said, as though offering reassurance not just to the woman, but to Daniel as well. Daniel acknowledged it with a brief glance, then took a small step back. Ranger rose immediately, falling into place beside him without command. The bond between them moved without words, without hesitation. The woman watched this, her eyes lingering on the way the dog mirrored Daniel's movement, the way neither needed to look at the other to know what came next. "Daniel," she said again, his name carrying a weight that had not been there before. He paused, turning slightly, enough to meet her gaze one last time. There was something different in her expression now. Not just gratitude, but recognition, as if she had seen something beyond the surface of a man most people would never stop to notice. "Thank you," she said quietly. The words were simple, but they settled into the space between them with a kind of permanence. Daniel held her gaze for a moment, then gave a faint nod. "Take care of yourself," he said. No more, no less. No expectation. No lingering. Just a closing that fit the moment as it was. The sirens grew louder now, the vehicle turning onto the street, lights reflecting softly against windows and pavement. People began to step back, creating space, their attention shifting fully to the arriving help. The driver moved toward the curb, ready to meet them, his focus no longer divided. In that shift, Daniel saw his opening. He turned without hesitation this time, stepping away from the scene with the same quiet presence he had arrived with. Ranger stayed close, his paws moving in sync, his head turning once briefly as if to look back, then forward again, choosing to follow rather than linger. They walked past the diner, past the curb where Daniel's empty cup still sat, past the places that marked the edges of a life lived between moments. No one stopped them. No one called after them. And that was how Daniel preferred it. Behind them, voices rose, instructions given, the rhythm of urgency replacing the fragile stillness that had held for just a few minutes. Ahead of them, the street stretched on, unchanged, indifferent, waiting. Daniel did not look back. He had learned long ago that looking back did not change what came next. But something had shifted, whether he chose to see it or not. A name had been spoken. A moment had been witnessed. And somewhere, in a place neither of them could yet see, that moment was not ending. It was being remembered. Days passed the way they always did, one folding quietly into the next without announcement or change, as if time itself had learned not to expect anything from Daniel Hayes. the city moved around him with the same steady indifference, morning traffic building and fading, storefronts opening and closing, people stepping in and out of lives that had structure and direction. Daniel remained on the edges of it all, where the noise softened and the details blurred. The memory of that morning did not stay at the front of his mind, but it did not disappear either. It settled somewhere deeper, like a small stone dropped into still water, its ripples fading from sight but never truly gone. Ranger carried on as he always did, alert, watchful, his presence constant in a world that offered very little certainty. The dogs. Movements had grown slightly slower, the edges of his energy softened by time, but his loyalty had not changed. If anything, it had deepened, becoming quieter, more deliberate, as if he understood that what they had was not something to be taken lightly. Winter edged closer with each passing day, the air growing sharper, the nights longer and less forgiving. Daniel adjusted the way he lived to match it, finding shelter where he could, learning the patterns of warmth and cold the way he once learned terrain and timing. There was no bitterness in it, not anymore. That had worn away over time, replaced by something steadier, something closer to acceptance. He did not expect the world to give him anything. And because of that, he was never disappointed when it did not. One afternoon, as the light began to fade earlier than it should, Daniel found himself back near the same stretch of street where everything had shifted days before. Not because he meant to return, but because the city had a way of guiding him in circles without asking. The diner was open this time, the faint glow of warm light spilling onto the sidewalk, carrying with it the smell of coffee and something frying on a worn stovetop. Ranger paused for a moment, his nose lifting slightly as if recognizing the place in a way Daniel did not fully acknowledge. Daniel stopped too, just for a second, his eyes scanning the familiar curb, the stretch of pavement where a moment had come and gone without leaving anything visible behind. There was no sign that anything had happened there. No mark, no memory, nothing to separate it from any other day. And yet, Daniel felt it. Not in a way that changed him, but in a way that reminded him that not all moments disappear just because they leave no trace. He adjusted his coat slightly, pulling it tighter against the cold, then moved on. That was what he did. He moved forward. Ranger followed, as he always did, his steps falling into rhythm beside Daniel's without effort. The city stretched ahead of them, unchanged, waiting, offering nothing more than it had the day before. And Daniel accepted that without question. Somewhere else, beyond the streets he walked and the nights he endured, something had already begun to take shape, quiet and unseen. Papers were being reviewed. Names were being spoken in rooms far removed from the cold sidewalks Daniel called home. A memory was being held onto with more care than he would have ever expected. But Daniel did not know any of that. He only knew the sound of his own footsteps, the steady presence of Ranger at his side, and the quiet understanding that life would continue exactly as it had. Until it did not. It happened on a morning that felt no different from the ones before it, the kind that carried a quiet routine Daniel no longer questioned. The sky was pale, stretched thin over the city like it had not fully decided to wake, and the air held that sharp edge of early winter that settled into the lungs with every breath. Daniel stood near the edge of a small public park, one of the few places where no one asked him to move along too quickly. Ranger sat beside him, his posture relaxed but alert, watching the slow movement of people passing by with a calm that came from long familiarity. There was nothing unusual about the moment, nothing that suggested anything was about to change. That was always how it happened. The black sedan approached without sound, gliding to a stop along the curb just beyond the park's entrance. It was not the same car as before, but it carried the same quiet presence, the same sense of something deliberate. Daniel noticed it, but only in passing, his attention drifting back to the path in front of him. Cars came and went. They were not his concern. The driver's door opened first this time, and a man stepped out, his movements precise, measured, as if each step had been planned before it was taken. He wore a dark suit, clean lines, no excess, the kind of appearance that belonged in offices with polished floors and quiet voices. In his hand, he carried a folder, held close against his side. Ranger was the first to react, his ears lifting slightly, his gaze fixing on the man as he approached. Daniel followed the dog's attention, his eyes narrowing just enough to focus. The man walked directly toward him, not hesitating, not scanning the surroundings, as if he already knew exactly where he was going. That alone was enough to set the moment apart. Most people did not walk toward Daniel. They walked around him. The man stopped a few feet away, maintaining a respectful distance, his posture straight but not rigid. For a brief second, he simply looked at Daniel, as if confirming something he had already decided. Then he spoke. "Mr. Hayes," he said, his voice calm, clear, carrying a tone that suggested certainty rather than question. Daniel did not respond immediately. The name hung in the air, unfamiliar in this context, like something pulled from a life he no longer lived. He glanced once at Ranger, then back at the man. "You have the wrong person," Daniel said, his voice low, steady, not defensive, just factual. The man gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "No, sir," he replied. "I do not." He opened the folder then, the sound of paper shifting soft but distinct in the quiet space between them. Daniel watched without moving, his expression unchanged, though something beneath it had begun to tighten, not fear, not hope, just awareness. The man glanced briefly at the page, then back up. "My name is William Carter," he said. "I am an attorney representing the estate of Eleanor Whitmore." The name settled into the air differently this time. Not as a memory, but as a connection. Daniel's gaze sharpened slightly, recognition flickering just beneath the surface. Ranger shifted closer, his shoulder brushing against Daniel's leg, grounding him in the present. "She asked that you be found," William continued, his tone measured, respectful. It took some time. Daniel let out a slow breath, his eyes drifting briefly to the ground before returning to the man. "I do not know anyone by that name," he said. It was not entirely untrue. He had never asked. The man studied him for a moment, then reached into the folder and pulled out a single photograph. He held it out, not too close, just enough for Daniel to see. It was a simple image. A woman seated on a curb, her posture slightly unsteady, her hand resting lightly on the head of a German shepherd. Daniel stood beside her, his expression calm, his presence steady in a moment that had long since passed. The city blurred in the background, but the moment itself was clear. Daniel did not take the photograph. He did not need to. He remembered. "She remembered you," William said quietly. The words landed without force, but they carried weight all the same. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, not in resistance, but in something closer to disbelief. The world did not remember men like him. It moved on too quickly for that. "She left instructions," William continued. "Very specific ones." The wind moved through the park, rustling the dry leaves along the path, carrying with it a stillness that felt almost deliberate. Daniel stood there, caught between the life he knew and something he did not yet understand. And for the first time in a long while, the future did not look like a straight line. It looked like a question. Daniel did not reach for the photograph, but his eyes did not leave it either, as if looking too long might make it disappear or change into something easier to understand. The park around them continued its quiet rhythm, footsteps passing, distant conversations rising and falling, but none of it seemed to touch the space where he stood. William Carter lowered the photograph slightly, not withdrawing it, just easing the moment forward without pressure. "She spoke about that day often," he said, his voice calm, measured, the kind of tone that carried truth without needing emphasis. "Not as an incident. As a decision." Daniel's brow tightened just slightly, the words settling into him in a way he did not immediately accept. A decision. To him, it had not been anything more than a moment that asked something simple, and he had answered it the only way he knew how. Ranger shifted beside him, his presence steady, his eyes moving between Daniel and the man as if reading the tension neither of them spoke aloud. "I did not do anything special," Daniel said after a moment, his voice low, almost dismissive, as though minimizing it might return the world to something familiar. William gave a small nod, not in agreement, but in understanding. "That is precisely why it mattered," he replied. The words did not argue. They simply stayed. A light wind moved through the trees, carrying dry leaves across the pavement in soft, uneven patterns. William opened the folder again, this time with more intention, and removed a set of documents bound together with a simple clip. He did not hand them over yet. Miss Whitmore had no immediate family, he continued. Her estate was extensive. But she made one thing very clear in her final instructions. He paused briefly, not for effect, but to ensure the weight of what came next would not be lost in the noise of the world around them. She said that if the man who helped her that morning could be found, then everything connected to her private property in Montana would be transferred to him. Daniel's eyes shifted then, not sharply, but enough to show that something inside him had moved. Montana, he repeated quietly, the word unfamiliar in his mouth, distant in a way that felt unreal. William nodded once. A working farm. 120 acres. Fully paid, maintained, and held in trust until this condition could be fulfilled. The numbers did not seem to land at first. They floated somewhere just beyond Daniel's understanding, too large, too removed from the life he knew. Ranger let out a soft breath, his body leaning slightly closer, as if anchoring Daniel to the ground beneath him. "Why me?" Daniel asked finally, not in disbelief, but in something closer to confusion. It was not a question about worth. It was a question about reason. William looked at him for a moment, then reached into the folder once more and pulled out a single folded page. He opened it carefully, the crease soft from having been handled more than once. "She left a statement," he said. "For you." Daniel did not take it, so William read instead, his voice steady, respectful, carrying the words as they had been written. "He did not ask who I was. He did not ask what I could give him. He only stayed because I needed someone to stay. In a world where everything has a price, I wanted to leave something to a man who proved, even for a moment, that not everything does." The word settled into the space between them, quiet but undeniable. Daniel's gaze dropped slightly, not in shame, not in pride, but in something harder to define. Ranger pressed lightly against his leg, a silent reassurance that required no understanding. William folded the paper again, placing it back into the folder with care. "She spent years trying to find you," he added softly. "Not to repay you. To make sure that what she believed about you was true." Daniel let out a slow breath, his eyes lifting back toward the man, then beyond him, toward the street, the park, the life he had known up until this moment. It all looked the same. Nothing had changed. And yet, everything had already begun to. The wind moved differently out here, not trapped between buildings or softened by concrete, but open and honest as it rolled across the land in long, steady breaths. Daniel stood just inside the gate now, his boots pressing into soil that gave slightly beneath his weight, a feeling so unfamiliar it almost unsettled him. Behind him, the world he knew had already begun to fade, not erased, but distant, like something remembered rather than lived. Ranger stepped forward first, his pace slow but certain, nose low as he traced the scent of grass, earth, and something older that had been waiting long before they arrived. The farmhouse stood about 100 yards ahead, quiet and still, its windows catching the pale light in a way that felt less like abandonment and more like patience. Daniel took a few steps forward, then stopped again, his eyes scanning the land as if searching for something that would tell him this was real. 120 acres. The number still did not sit right in his mind. It was too large, too far removed from sidewalks and overpasses and nights measured in hours rather than distance. William remained by the car, giving space without needing to be asked, his presence respectful, distant, as if he understood that this moment did not belong to him. Daniel exhaled slowly, the air leaving him in a long, steady breath that carried more than just the cold. Ranger turned back briefly, his eyes meeting Daniel's, not questioning, not urging, just waiting. Always waiting. Daniel nodded once, almost to himself, then began to walk. Each step forward felt uncertain at first, not because of the ground, but because of what it meant. The barn came into clearer view, its red paint faded but intact, the wood worn in places that spoke of years rather than neglect. A fence line stretched along the edge of the property, straight and steady, marking boundaries that had held long before Daniel ever knew they existed. The silence out here was different. It was not empty. It was full, layered with the sound of wind through grass, the distant creak of wood, the quiet movement of something alive beneath the surface. Ranger broke into a light run, his energy lifting in a way Daniel had not seen in a long time, his paws cutting through the field with a sense of purpose that needed no explanation. Daniel watched him go, a faint shift in his expression, something softer, something that had not had space to exist in the life he had been living. He reached the porch slowly, his hand lifting to rest against the wooden railing, feeling the texture beneath his fingers, real, solid, unmoving. This was not temporary. It was not borrowed. It was his. The thought settled in slowly, not as excitement, but as something quieter, something deeper. A place. Not just shelter, not just space, but a place that did not ask him to leave. Ranger returned then, moving up the steps with ease, standing beside Daniel as if claiming the space not with ownership, but with belonging. Daniel looked down at him, then out across the land once more, the horizon stretching wide and unbroken. He did not smile. He did not speak. He simply stood there, his hand resting against the wood, his breath steady, his presence finally anchored to something that would not move on without him. And in that quiet, with nothing left to prove and nothing asked in return, a man who had once been forgotten was given something the world rarely offers twice. Not money. Not luck. But a place to stay. And for the first time in a long while, Daniel Hayes did not feel like he was passing through. He felt like he had arrived.